Back in 2007, when David Beckham signed with the LA Galaxy, he was an unprecedented signing. There were no players signed to an MLS team that had a reputation of his level at the time of his signing, and probably in the history of MLS. Along with his impressive salary in the contract, it also gave him an option to buy an MLS expansion franchise for $25 million after he retired, which at the time when he signed in 2007, that was about the market price for an MLS expansion franchise, quite far off from the current market value now, which is about $300 million, as long as he would not put that team in New York. Now, as David Beckham was approaching his retirement back in 2013, he was beginning to look at exercising his option to purchase an MLS expansion franchise. Now, to get an MLS expansion franchise, you have to know what city you want to put that franchise in. So he was beginning to look at some markets, but he was looking at one in particular, and that was Miami. Now, if he would be successful with this bid, this would not be the first time that an MLS team would be put in Miami. Who were the first team? The Miami Fusion. The Fusion were a team that began their first season in 1998 but ended up folding in 2001. There were various reasons why the team folded, but a major part was due to lack of fan support and corporate support. Oddly enough, the team started playing well in their final season, possibly being one of the most exciting MLS squads of all time. And actually, they had an uptick in support in that season as a result of those good performances. However, it was not good enough, so both Floridan teams, the Tampa Bay Mutiny and the Fusion, were folded come the end of the 2001 season. But before he could get this expansion franchise accepted by MLS, he would need to get a solid stadium proposal so that they would accept the bid eventually, because they would see that it would be quite successful. Now, this might sound easy, but it was a lot harder than initially thought. In February of 2014, MLS announced that David Beckham had officially exercised his option to purchase an MLS franchise. Now, after he did this, he composed a group named Miami Beckham United, and it was of three people. One was David Beckham, no surprise. The other one was a man named Simon Fuller. He was a British entrepreneur. Another man was a Bolivian businessman and more of a Miami local who had tried to put a team in Miami back in 2008 and 2009 in the Barcelona-Miami expansion bid, and that man was Marcelo Clore. So they had proposed 6 main stadium deals. Ultimately, many of them were not successful. Some of them were successful, but they ended up pulling out. And it would be quite hard to get this stadium built. And MLS Commissioner Don Garber, after a few unsuccessful ones, ultimately said they would not accept the expansion proposal if they didn't have a solid stadium plan. So there was a lot of pressure on Miami Beckham United to get this thing right. So I'll go through all six stadium proposals that have led up to the current one. The first one was Port Miami. This bid was a planned 25,000 capacity stadium that would be placed on part of the Miami seaport. However, there was a lot of campaigning against the site, particularly from local seaport companies, so the council ultimately voted 11-1 against it. So quite a harsh vote. By this point, Miami Beckham United had called it Plan B and had already moved their focus to another proposal, Museum Park. So Museum Park was a pretty intriguing option, as basically what this proposed was to fill in a boat slip in between the American Airlines Arena and Museum Park, where they would fill in this boat slip and they would build a 20,000 capacity stadium on this thing. Now, this was pretty good because it would not tear down many local businesses, and it would also be building a stadium in downtown Miami, which was crucial to this bid. This is what MLS really wanted. They wanted downtown stadiums at this point in time. In the past, they had been fine with building in the outskirts, but they were beginning to see that that was not a good idea and that they needed to start building stadiums in the downtown like how Toronto FC did back in 2007 with BMO Field. Now, this bid ultimately died because of local opposition, but also a major part was the fact that they were struggling in rent negotiations with the city, so then they ended up scrapping that bid and going to the third bid. Now, just before I get to that, as David Beckham started to get frustrated with this, and the group overall started to get frustrated with negotiating with all these politicians after all of these bids, There was reports that they were beginning to think of buying out in mid-2014 Chivas USA, who at the time were a declining team. Let's remember at the end of 2014 they ended up folding, and they're being the latest team to fold. There hasn't been a team since then who has folded as of 2020. Now, in mid-2014, he was looking at purchasing the team reportedly. However, MLS denied those rumors. Then there was the Little Havana Stadium. Now, back in 2008 and 2009, actually when Barcelona-Miami was an expansion bid, there was talk about actually building a stadium in the future right beside Marlins Park. Now, that ended up, of course, not working out. The whole Barcelona-Miami bid didn't work out. Then David Beckham and his group decided to create a proposal to build a stadium in the area. I don't think it was explicitly saying right beside Marlins Park, but it was generally speaking in that area. However, this didn't work because they were having trouble acquiring private land in the area to build a stadium, but also, this was the biggest part, Major League Soccer was completely against this idea because it wasn't fully in the downtown, which had become a major part of building a stadium at this point in time. It would have to be an absolutely amazing bid to not build in the downtown. Then the Overtown Proposal was begun almost immediately after the failure of the Little Havana bid. This proposal was the closest Miami Beckham United got at the time to getting a stadium deal done. They purchased all the land they needed to build the stadium. MLS approved of the location, and come 2017, everything looked like it had come into play to build their stadium finally. The saga had finally ended, it looked like. However, a man named Jorge Mas, who had become quite notable in the Inter Miami ownership group, bought into this Miami MLS side at that point, and he decided to stop this plan in favor of a more ambitious project at Freedom Park in Miami. So just keep that in mind, that had Jorge Mas not bought into this bid, we would probably see a stadium getting built a little bit earlier for this Miami MLS side, but also it would be in this Overtown area as opposed to closer to the Miami International Airport where this Freedom Park bid is. So again, Freedom Park is the successful stadium plan that plans to create a recreational park near, as I said, Miami International Airport on top of Melreese Country Club, a city-owned golf course. So they're going to get rid of the golf course and they're going to build this recreational park with a bunch of soccer facilities that some the public can use and some's going to be like it's going to be like the stadium and for private use and stuff like that. So it's going to be a nice mix of stuff that the local community can use, but stuff that you have to pay to access, like watching a game of Inter Miami. Of course, that's not going to be free. So I think they're just trying to sell this to the Miami-Dade Council. I believe this is going to be a project around $1 billion too, so it's a very big, ambitious project to take on. The stadium itself would be 25,000 capacity and looks clearly the most exciting looking soccer specific MLS stadiums in the league at the moment looking at current renders. However, I have a feeling the designs will change to something more boring looking in the future, as that seems to be something that happens a lot with expansion franchises. They make amazing looking stadium plans when they're trying to get approved, and then they scale down the design a bit to save some costs when they do eventually get approved. We did see this with FC Cincinnati, where they had a bit of a nicer looking stadium plan, or maybe a more expensive looking one. The looks are a bit subjective in terms of if you think it looks nicer or not, but in my opinion it looked a lot nicer before, and then they opted to do a more conventional looking stadium plan that looks quite good, this West End Stadium, but it definitely looks a little bit less ambitious, and I'm sure it was a little bit cheaper. And that's what seems to be happening lately with MLS. So you have to always be a little bit suspicious, but you never know, maybe they will build the stadium that they've currently got rendered. The stadium project was approved in late 2019 by Miami voters in a referendum, and a 99-year lease is being negotiated with Miami MLS. The stadium construction is planned to finish in 2022. There have been some problems over the past bit though, as there may be some significant cost overruns due to a lot of chemicals and debris in the soil because of the golf course that they're building on top of. Now let's keep in mind that golf courses kind of use a lot of chemicals to keep that grass green and to keep the water looking nice and to keep all the bugs out of the area and the weeds not growing. So that's probably why they found so many chemicals in the soil. But it looked like they were expecting that they would find some chemicals and debris in the soil, but it was like over the amount that they thought. On the other hand, though, this is totally separate from that. A really good aspect of this project, as it is said to be completely privately funded, something that local politicians wanted after the blunder of subsidies given to Marlins Park when it was being built. Now there are some other stadium proposals like the one with University of Miami. Now this one with University of Miami was kind of interesting because Miami MLS was looking at building at max a 25,000 capacity stadium, but University of Miami was looking at building a little bit over 40,000 capacity stadium. Interestingly enough, University of Miami wanted to move out of their previous stadium because it was a little bit too big for them, but they still wanted a fairly big stadium in the first place, which ended up ruining this whole deal that they're trying to create with them, where they were going to build a joint stadium. But ultimately it was just not realistic when University of Miami wanted a 40,000 capacity stadium and Miami MLS wanted a 25,000 capacity stadium at the max. Now there was also talk about FIU Stadium. This was mainly from politicians. Basically when they started rejecting all these proposals, then they started suggesting temporary stadiums, and the main one was FIU Stadium. Now FIU Stadium is actually also considered to be the location where Barcelona Miami would play back in the day. Actually this was the consensus that they came up with at the end of the bid, but the problem was that even back in the day in 2008 and 2009, this stadium wasn't really up to par for MLS. Most of the seats were actually, well, most of the places where you could sit were actually bench seating. It wasn't so much like regular seats that you see in most stadiums in MLS to this day. Yeah, the stadium wasn't really up to par. The turf was in bad condition. In fact, FIU Stadium was rebranded after Ricardo Silva, the owner of Miami FC, paid money to tear out the pitch and replace it with a good pitch and replace some things in the stadium and fix it up. But before that, it was not in the greatest condition. So so this wouldn't have been a good stadium to play soccer in. Now there's another proposal too that they were considering at one point, I believe. There's some speculation over whether they were considering playing in Marlins Park. Now I think in hindsight that's probably good, being that they didn't play in Marlins Park, because I mean we look at New York City FC, who started playing in a baseball stadium in Yankee Stadium in 2015 in their first season. They're still playing in it now, and it's got one of the worst pitches. Well, it is the worst pitch in the league. On January 29th, 2018, we're not completely going in chronological order here, but Miami Beckham United announced that Miami MLS would be joining MLS as the 25th club and would launch in the 2020 MLS season, which is also funny enough, MLS's 25th season. Now, despite them announcing the team, the stadium deal at the time was still a little shaky, as of course they announced their arrival to MLS when they were originally going to build their stadium in Overtown. That was the common knowledge at the time when they announced. It seemed pretty secure actually at the time. It didn't seem so shaky, but then we would find out later that they would change this whole thing when they suddenly changed the idea that they wanted to build in Freedom Park, and that left a lot of people quite annoyed with the bid. This change of plans made it almost impossible to get their stadium plan executed by the start of 2020, and Miami would later announce that they would not use Marlins Park or Hard Rock Stadium as a temporary stadium. So they were facing a bit of a crisis in terms of what they would use temporarily. That's where the Fort Lauderdale training complex idea was birthed. Just under 1 year ahead of their first season, the team announced that they would be building an entire new training complex for the team to play in, and a stadium in the northern outskirt of Miami, Fort Lauderdale. In fact, they would be tearing down the stadium that the Miami Fusion played in, Lockhart Stadium, along with the facilities surrounding to build the stadium complex. Many of them were skeptical about this plan, including me, as to how they would get everything done so fast, but come today, it's clear that they got all the boots on the ground to at least get some of the more major parts built, including the 18,000 capacity stadium, Inter Miami CF Stadium. On September 5th, 2018, the name and logo was announced. The team would be named Club Internacional de Football Miami, or Inter Miami CF for short. The logo looked like one of the best ones in the league. However, the name raised a lot of eyebrows. One part was how it sounded like a mouthful to many, especially using Inter in the name. It didn't really flow off the tongue very well, especially to me. I found it, like a lot of people found Inter Miami sounds like a real mouthful, but come now it doesn't sound as bad as I originally thought, and I kinda like the name. Also, it was definitely different that Inter Miami would be the first team named in Spanish. Funny enough, the team would get sued by Inter Milan for copyright infringement, being that at the time of their announcement, and still now, Inter is a registered trademark in the US by Inter Milan. However, the court proceedings are still going on, but there is a chance that Inter Miami could have to rebrand in the future should they lose the case. So as the 2020 season began to approach, Inter Miami started to get their ducks in a row. First of all, they announced that they would be launching a USL League One team in their inaugural season. Like in the inaugural season of Inter Miami, they would also be launching another team named Fort Lauderdale Soccer Club. There's a lot of talk about them potentially naming their second team Fort Lauderdale Strikers, but it doesn't really go along with the brand, especially the colors are different than the purple and black that Inter Miami is going with. Anyway, they ended up signing Pat McDonough as the sporting director and chief operating officer. He was the technical director for Atlanta United, the same team that won the 2018 MLS Cup and has had many successful players play for the team, so he was a very good signing. They ended up signing Diego Alonso too, the Uruguayan manager, who was a manager in South America. One of the things that many people have to say about Inter Miami is that it was quite underwhelming with their player signings. I'm not saying that the players are bad, but there's a lot of speculation ever since David Beckham announced that he wanted to put a team in Miami, that all these big stars would come over to join Miami. You know, we would see Cristiano Ronaldo. They would hype up that they were trying to sign Cristiano Ronaldo or like Lionel Messi, those kind of players. But of course they never came. I don't think people were exactly expecting them to ever come. But there is no big player, big name player of any type who's like worldwide known. Like the top player who was signed for Inter Miami was Mexican international Rodolfo Pizarro, who according to Matt Doyle on MLS Soccer, but Matt Doyle said that Rodolfo Pizarro is extremely inconsistent. They spent about over $10 million, so I sure hope he's a good return on investment. But he was the most notable player who they signed, which is a little bit underwhelming in terms of how they were saying right up to the time that Inter Miami played their first game that they might sign David Silva, which is a lot more of a world-known player than Rodolfo Pizarro. However, it's still interesting that they signed some nice players for Inter Miami. I'm not saying that their squad's bad again. I'm just saying with the type of players that they were talking about ever since like 2013 or 2014 about players who were interested in joining, it was quite underwhelming in that extent. Anyway, Inter Miami would lose their inaugural game away against LAFC 1-0. They have yet to play their first home game because that was delayed. Originally, they were going to play against LA Galaxy for their first home game. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, they ended up not playing their first home game against LA Galaxy. That was suspended. They are going to be kicking off their third game against Orlando City Soccer Club on July 8th, 2020. They're going to be playing it in the MLS's back tournament. So yeah, so their home opener might be a while to come, but it will be nice to see once the Inter Miami fans get to finally go and watch their team in Miami. Unfortunately, it's delayed for now. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. Please like it if you enjoyed it, and please subscribe if you want to see more content like this. This is actually my 10th video and final video or it should be my final video of this Miami area soccer history series. So please check out my other videos in this series. I made, of course, 9 videos previous to this. I'll leave a link in the description down below. Anyway, thank you for watching this series and this video, and until next time, see ya.